No sounds
Okay,
here.
that's better.
Nope, we're good now. It's coming through. There is going to be a slight delay.
There it is.
Yeah,
All right,
okay.
all right.
We're
We got this.
mobile
Solid.
programmers, not YouTube.
We're not YouTubers yet.
Yeah.
All right, welcome everyone to the first ever live Ionic show. My name is Ben. You guys know Max. This is Adam. I think Adam, you've been on one of the Ionic shows in the past.
One or two of them, yes.
Talking Ionic.
Yep.
And Justin is here. Justin, welcome to your first ever Ionic show.
Yep, first ever Ionic show.
Justin's a developer advocate here. For those of you who don't know, he's very active on Twitter, so you should check him out there if you haven't already. So we got a lot to talk about today. We haven't done an Ionic show in it's been a long time. Yeah, it's been a really long time. But
I don't even think I was hired on full time yet when we did the last one.
and
that was one of the first PWAs that I built with Ionic was on the last one.
Okay.
And it was like Ionic 2 beta or something.
It was a long time ago. We had a bit of it was a good time. We read a bad post on the forum.
It's my favorite clip.
But it was a good time, and I will say we haven't had an Ionic show for good reason, probably mostly because of the fact that we've been so heads down working on trying to get the latest version of Ionic out, plus a bunch of new projects that we're going to talk about today. So I guess with that said, why don't we just get the show started? One of the things, actually, real quick before I start the show, if you guys have questions, feel free to throw them in the little YouTube live chat here, and I'll make sure that I try to get to as many as I can. Yep. I'm gonna try to find a break midway through the show, or when I feel like I can just inject them in to make sure that you guys' voices are heard, and that we can address whatever questions you might have about certain things as we go through the show. So we're gonna try to have some Q&A in this one, which will be fun. I'm gonna mostly be playing host today, so we'll see how that goes. But I think with that said, let's start the show.
Let's do it.
So all right, guys. I think the first thing that I want to talk about, and I think we should talk about, is Stencil.
Stencil, yes.
We started off this whole endeavor together as a team building Ionic framework, and along the way, specifically this fall, we released a new project called Stencil. For those of you who don't know, you can find it at stenciljs.com right now. But what is Stencil? Can someone just sort of give the background of what it is?
So I know it's going to go longer than I want to, but I'll say real quick. All right, so with Stencil, one of our goals was to allow developers to use Ionic in whatever framework they wanted to use. Traditionally, it's always been Angular because we love Angular. We started with Angular 1, we've ported to Angular 2, now 4. Upgrading to Angular 5, but with that we were very limited to only the Angular community. So with Stencil, we kind of evaluated. We wanted to look into allowing it to work in React and Vue and all the other different frameworks. And a couple months ago, as we were looking into this, we realized that actually web components are a reality now, and web components can easily be used. And so we decided to take a serious look into that. It's how can we move Ionic into more of a generic system that would work anywhere? And that's exactly what web components are. And so that's what Stencil has enabled us to do. And so Stencil takes the core of web components and kind of sprinkles in a few more things of the stuff that we really like about frameworks, such as making it easy to use JSX, making it easy to use add event listeners, and all the niceties that you see in a framework. But what it compiles is just another web component. So the output of it is just simple web component JavaScript. Can be used anywhere. It can be used in a jQuery app, can be used in vanilla JavaScript, can be used in the biggest React app you've ever seen. It doesn't matter. Basically, we step away from the framework world and we allow you to use whatever you enjoy using.
Should we go back to the why we picked Angular in the first place and how it plays in? So back in 2013, I think Angular 1.1 was out when we started working on Ionic 1. And the reason we picked it was, well, we kept hearing about it from everyone, so that helped. But we wanted a framework where we could define custom HTML tags. We came from jQuery Mobile and jQuery, and the thing about jQuery is you had to manually instantiate elements, whereas Angular automatically let you write custom JavaScript components that would automatically run if the user typed the tag. And so for us, web components was kind of the actual dream we were going after. It just wasn't ready back in 2013. And Angular was a great choice, and it's still a great choice today. And we've been all writing Angular all week, so we love it. Yeah. But the dream was always custom HTML tags.
And And even if you look at our very first commits, you'll see that we had a bindings directory.
Yep.
And in that directory, it had Angular, Ember, Backbone, jQuery, I think a couple different ones.
Yeah, I've
Originally,
actually
we're
gone
like,
back
we're
and
just going to
seen that.
support all of them.
Yeah.
And then we started doing Angular, and we're like, oh shit,
Yeah, this
we
is
are not going to do all of them.
well, it's very difficult to do
Yeah,
just
it
one.
was a timing
Yeah.
thing too. Like right when Ionic 1 started to become a thing, AngularJS was like the
Oh,
new
yeah,
kid on the block, like
2013,
the
yeah.
big,
that was
like
the height of
Google-backed Angular,
I
project.
think-
So
I
this
think
is kind of
actually,
like-
we had Backbone. We took some code out of Backbone to try to build like a component model. Do you remember
Yeah.
that? It was like
Yeah,
the class
we did.
system and the view system.
Yes,
I think-
that's right.
I think all that
And
got ripped
controllers
out,
and all that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
But I think what Stencil is enabling us to do is the original goal that we had of allowing people to just use whatever they want to use, and just we provide the awesome components, the checkbox, toggles, all the cool stuff that you want to use, so that you can focus on building your application and not focus on how does a menu work.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we've realized, we all use different frameworks here. Like some of us really like React, some really like Vue, some
Polymer.
wish we could just include an HTML tag, Polymer,
Polymer.
Polymer, and of course Angular. So for us, like externally, we're just Angular, but internally we were pretty diverse. And I think we all came to the conclusion that like, it feels more like opinion than it does, oh, Angular is 10 times better than React, or React's 10 times better. In reality, like we're all building the same stuff with the same tools that generally are the same. The APIs are just more of like an opinion at this point.
Yeah.
So we didn't want to have to bind ourselves to any single opinion.
So would you say that's partially how Stencil was born, out of this desire to not be bound so much? Like,
Yeah.
how did that come about? Like, because I feel like all of a sudden we were like, well, this is going to be a thing, this like Stencil thing.
That's how it
And-
always goes with Adam.
Yeah. No,
yeah, Adam basically disappeared for like 30 days and then came back and was like, his hair was all frizzled and his eyes were all bloodshot. And he's like, guys, web components.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
not
We're
far
like
off.
the doc from Back to the Future.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of it had to do with, as we ported, we went through a lot of work to port from Angular 1 to Angular 2. And just that alone was a lot of work. And I think during that process, we realized that we don't necessarily need to play this game, because what we're providing are just components of, fancy CSS and event listeners. We don't necessarily need to be tied to a specific framework. And so as we're porting to Angular 2, Angular 4, we start kind of questioning we're getting all sorts of questions of like, we want, Vue.js is great, React is great. So,
Right.
so we're like, okay, so let's make an Ionic React. And, about 5 minutes in, you realize this is also going to be a very large project.
Yeah.
Right.
So you can say, wasn't there an Ionic React repo for
Yeah.
at least a little while?
Yeah.
And there's-
Yeah.
And there were some third-party like community projects.
Yep.
Like
There was like
Ionic React,
React,
yeah,
Ionic or
and
something.
then Phonic or something.
Yeah,
Right,
Ionic, yeah.
But yeah, building a framework custom to a framework is so much work that we didn't want to do that ever again. We wanted to like write it once so we could maintain it and improve it
Right.
and focus on Ionic rather than focusing on the bindings.
Right. So how does Stencil work with Ionic specifically? Like, how does it
Right.
connect with Ionic? How do they relate?
Right. So so far we've probably been pretty misleading. It's like, we don't like frameworks, so let's build another one.
Yeah,
That's
right.
not what's happening here. So basically, Stencil is a compiler for web components. And so it's built for us for the use of building Ionic to allow many people to consume Ionic. But what it actually generated is just JavaScript. Again, so back to the fact that it doesn't matter what runs it. And so let me backtrack a little bit. So with Stencil, it's something that actually consumers of Ionic don't even need to know about. It doesn't matter. And so like, don't let that scare you that this is a new thing you need to learn. This is actually just what Ionic is using as core contributors is using to build Ionic and make it easy for us to maintain. I think we've got 91 components, which is not easy. And then also some of the lessons that we put in, or the lessons learned that we put into Stencil, was that with Ionic Angular, we've got, again, 90 some components. And it's very difficult to make it easy to use all 90 of them without using or downloading the entire library. And everything included, you can get a very large app very quickly.
Yep.
And so that's easily some of the lessons learned from the past. And so
we got a lot of feedback from the community on that, of how code splitting worked, but it wasn't great. There was still big bundles,
Well,
etc.
Yeah, we
Right.
really struggled to get like tree shaking to really
Yep,
ever
tree shaking.
work.
yeah, and so we wanted to take the same ideas. We want to make it easy to use Ionic. We want to just write an Ion button and it's going to work. But at the same time, we don't want you to download the world, and we also don't want you to have a massive configuration of how to use just Ion button. And so that's where Stencil kind of adds our own little flair for us to use, that only when Ion button is added to the DOM, Stencil is then smart enough to only request that and the CSS that you're using. That also includes the iOS and Material Design. So if you're not using the iOS, or you're not on an iOS platform, is only going to get the CSS for material design just for Ion button.
I think, so that's one of my favorite things about Stencil and Ionic Core, which is all the Ionic components that are being ported to web components using Stencil, is that the code splitting, normally you have to set up like a big Webpack config, et cetera, make sure imports are like the right type of imports, et cetera, to make sure that code splitting and stuff like that is working correctly. Whereas with Stencil, it's just not something you actually even have to like, you don't even have to know what code splitting is. We just handle it completely for you.
And that's a big part of Stencil
completely
too.
like actually zero config, like completely zero config.
And that's a big part of it too, is that we wanted to make sure that Stencil is as close to the standards as possible. We didn't want to reinvent how events work. We don't want to reinvent how to dynamically request a model or a module. So that's where we're using standards as much as possible. And then basically that's where the web components comes in. So when a web component hits the DOM, we're able to then use basically dynamic imports to now download exactly what we need and only what we need and render that right there. And so we're able to step away from the whole bundling scene and allow the browser to actually do the real work rather than having a developer at build time guess which stuff should go together. We're letting the browser be very specific of saying, you're using these components, let's go get those quick.
So one thing that I think we should talk about, because it's an important reason why we're moving to web standards. I think the feedback that we got, because we went from basically Angular 1 to Angular 2, and there was pretty much zero backwards compatibility. And actually, I'm impressed that people were so willing to upgrade. And I think, we're thankful that people took a risk because it was such a big improvement. But I think teams and companies kind of reached their breaking point with big framework switches. And I think with Angular specifically, like people still, the feedback we get from teams that haven't moved to Angular 2 is that they still love Angular 1. It's a perfectly great framework. It works well. They understand it. They have tools that work with it. So for Stencil and Ionic, we kind of took that as feedback that like maybe one of the values we can add here is less change. And to get to less change, we have to introduce a little bit of change, but hopefully a lot less than ever moving to another framework. And Stencil actually works in Angular 1 with some shims.
Yeah, right.
Like it's kind of automated shims, like you don't have to even realize it. So I think we'll end up, web components are going to end up breathing new life into some of these older frameworks.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to point out that like there is no Stencil API. Stencil doesn't exist in the browser at that point by the time that Ionic renders it. So what's happening is that to interact with a Ionic component, you're just using the property or the attribute or the event listener. So you're not learning a specific way to interact with Ionic, you're just using the DOM basically, or whatever framework you choose to use.
Yep. So I think that's a good point. Like going into kind of Ionic Angular 4 a touch, all the Ionic core components will be under the hood, web components, et cetera. And you'll still be writing Angular code on your end. So you don't even have to know that there are web components in your bundles.
So before we switch gears, because I want to make sure we talk about a bunch of different things today and keep us on track. We could probably talk for this whole show on Stencil, but how does this affect what is the performance like of web components in Stencil? Like,
sure.
Bottom line.
Yeah. So again, back to the biggest thing we want to do was to lazy load what you are actually using, and through that we were able to have the compiler do a lot of the work, and so that's where most of the work. If you look at the Stencil repo, you see that majority of what's going on is all in the compiler, all in the build step, and it is able to optimize tiny files and be able to download just exactly what you need, and even group things that you know are going to come together. So like example, Ion card, Ion header, Ion content. We know that you're going to use those components all together. So part of the compiler puts them all into the same file, and that file we're talking 2 kilobytes maybe.
So in a way, like we're doing bundling, but it's like micro bundling kind of.
And it's not on the user. It's not on the user. It's all it's basically part of the design of that web component to handle it for itself. And also a huge part of Stencil is to ensure that different versions can all work together. Because again, all we're using is events and properties and attributes to communicate. So if I've got a version, Stencil version 1 and Stencil version 2, they should be able to talk to each other just fine, because the only way that they can talk is through the standard DOM APIs.
So yeah, our tiny little loader file sitting up at like 5.7 kilobytes for a really basic app as it sits now. And then something that uses like a router, et cetera, it's in the 6 kilobyte range.
Yes, and so that's like
and that's like all the lazy loading stuff, all the code splitting stuff, all built in, async rendering,
Shadow DOM,
Shadow
success
DOM, all
variables.
within 6 kilobytes.
Maybe
So-
it's important to define like what performance means because it's such a loaded topic.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
like
That's a good point.
the thing is like Angular has great performance over Angular 1 with a lot of like rendering and like
Runtime.
when it's actually running, we're trying to optimize performance at load time is really a focus of ours because
Yep.
I think a lot of the feedback we've gotten from Ionic 2 is that apps tend to be a little bit slower to load because the way that it runs is it's loading everything up front and then running. So performance for us is like trying to reduce that time to first interactive like dramatically in some cases.
So it's all about the code that you ship in the first view. If you're only shipping 6 point something kilobytes on the first view, on the average device, that's going to parse way faster than potentially 1 megabyte.
You have a lot of examples too. I mean, just
so if you go to stenciljs.com/demos, there's a bunch of demos on there. So one of the Hacker News app that we have is sitting at like 3.2 seconds, or actually no, the latest is like 2.6 seconds to interactive, and that's on just to be clear, like a really, really slow network, so like 3G. So if you've like gone into a parking garage or something like that, and on an average device, so something like a Moto G that you can pick up for $100, $150, on a newer device such as an iPhone 10 like you have now, or a Pixel 2, you're looking at like instant if you're on Wi-Fi or 4G.
Yeah, that's an interesting change from like the way we used to do things. Like everyone's in the PWA era is testing on 3G slow networks, and instead of testing on their like home Wi-Fi or whatever.
Just on Chrome.
So
it's fun too.
anytime we report loading times, it's on those slow networks, and so it's kind of like any other network that's faster is going to be even faster.
So basically we're trying to optimize for like if you can optimize for the slowest situation, so like the lowest end device and the crappiest network, and that means on a newer device or a better device with a better network, you're going to be just that much faster. So if you're fast on low end devices, you're going to be blazing fast on a really good device.
So all right, I gotta get us moving on to other topics.
Yeah.
Stencil's very exciting though.
Yeah.
I have one more actually two more questions about Stencil that I want to make sure I clarify. One is, can you talk a little bit about polyfills?
Yeah, sure. So polyfills. So as everybody knows, Web Components V1 are native in Chrome and Safari. They're coming to Firefox. They're actually already in Firefox Nightly behind a flag. You can turn it on. And they're all Chromium-based browsers. So pretty much any browser you can install on an Android device has Web Components. Electron. The only one really missing out right now are Firefox and Edge, but I know it's definitely coming to Firefox, and Edge has showed some interest.
Under
Consideration or something like that.
Oh, I think they. Oh, I don't know. I won't speak for
So-
it. I thought it was agreed that they're going to start.
So there are some polyfills needed. Also, we do support IE11 with Stencil, although that's been a pretty good challenge to get it to work on IE.
It's not easy,
but
it
is working. I fight with it often there. So the polyfills, we handle that underneath the hood for you. So we have a little loader script that says, hey, do you support Web Components? Okay, you do. You probably don't need any of these polyfills, so you don't load them. If you're on a browser like IE11 that doesn't really support much of anything, then you get our full suite of polyfills. So this always means that no matter what browser you're on or something like that, first, the app is going to work for you. And second, you're never going to be loading more polyfills than you actually need.
Yeah,
This also includes them over time, like automatically.
Oh, yeah,
eventually
absolutely.
it won't even.
So
basically
we're kind of
be a
already
thing.
doing that. I mean, like we're only loading what. So like the initials on Chrome, Safari, really most things. You're going to get just the bare bones. ES6 even.
Oh yeah, that's another good point. We're shipping ES6 now.
We're just finishing the dynamic imports, which just shipped in Chrome.
So it's because it's all done with like feature detection basically as Firefox. So like as Web Components make it to stable Firefox, then you'll automatically you won't even have to update your app or PWA or whatever.
Exactly.
It'll just automatically start getting smaller bundles.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, I'm going to save a few more questions about it until we get to the questions and answers part of the show. So I'm going to move you guys along.
Okay, thank you.
We're gonna transition, as I think it's time to talk about Ionic Framework, the project itself, because
sure.
I mean, the last time we talked about it, we were in Ionic 2 beta.
Yep.
And now we're approaching Ionic 4 very quickly.
Yeah.
So I wanna give people kind of some insight on what's been going on with Ionic Framework proper. So I guess the first question, or the first thing that we should talk about, is like what's new? What's new with Ionic Framework v4?
So V4 is going to be using Stencil under the hood, with the goal that you'll be able to take your Ionic Angular V3 app and upgrade to Ionic Angular V4.
Is that going to be
minimal changes?
Yeah. What is that upgrade process going to be like? Is it going to be a pain like Ionic 1 to Ionic 2 was because of the Angular 2 shift, or is it going to be?
It'll be not nearly as a shift that it was from Ionic or Angular 1 to 2.
I feel like it'll be a lot of find and replace kind of things.
Yes.
So like slot, and so instead of
ng content and slot.
Yeah, it's slot, and then instead of like what is it? Fill block or whatever for the button now to make it go across. So it used to be block, and now it's like fill equals block.
Yeah,
so
we're moving to like actual named attributes instead.
Yes,
but it's a lot of like VS Code find and replace kind of things.
Okay.
Yeah, and then that's all stuff that we're finishing out right now. So what we're using is our Ionic Conference app that is currently in Ionic Angular 3, and we're using that to test out what the process is to go to 4. So really, our goal is to make it as painless as possible. And really, you're going to continue to use Angular just how you've always used Angular. So if you've built this huge, enormous app in Angular, don't worry, you're still going to continue to use Angular just the same way.
Yeah, I would say for Angular 2 or Angular, the change is going to be a lot less because we're really trying to keep the APIs similar.
Yep.
So we have some things that might not map if you're using like Vue or React. You're not going to have some of the same things we have in Angular 2, like some of our services. Those are probably not going to be in there because we're keeping those mainly as backwards compatibility, would you say?
Cool.
The injectable
like some of the injectors they make more sense in Angular than they do in other.
Oh, right. Yeah. So I mean, most of our logic of Ionic itself has moved to the web component layer.
Yeah.
And so what's actually in Ionic Angular is about 4 kilobytes of code.
And I was actually just reading what is that, like custom elements everywhere, that
Yeah.
score thing.
Yep.
Angular 2 Plus has the best custom.
Yeah,
one of the best
absolutely.
custom
I mean, they
elements.
designed it
100,
from the ground up to work with web components.
Yeah. So
And-
it's one of the best ways to use it.
All right. So Stencil is a big change
Well, big change for
in terms
For
of something
us,
that's new, right?
but
right.
for users going from 3 to 4, you're still going to, I mean, you're not really upgrading frameworks. I mean, you're still using Angular 5, Angular 4, Angular 5. And so that's kind of the comparison before is like you were going from Angular 1 to Angular 2.
Right.
With that, you had to change Ionic change. So that was a big change for everyone. But in this case, you're still on the same version of Angular for the most part.
Yeah.
So
With a couple API changes of power.
So I mean, with Ionic Angular 4, really, you don't even have to know there's web components underneath.
Right.
All of your code is still going to be Angular. It's just the Ionic components themselves will be web components.
Yep.
Cool. So it will still work with Angular, and,
Yep.
Yeah,
and for the most
absolutely.
part, the experience, the developer experience, shouldn't be too different if you're used to building.
Exactly. It
with
should
Ionic
be,
Angular.
you know, that's their biggest goal is to make it just as seamless as possible.
Right.
And there shouldn't be any fear that you need to rewrite your entire app again. So continue to use Angular.
Yeah.
So with that said, what if you or your team is building in React or building with Vue?
That's awesome.
How is Ionic 4 going to handle something like that?
So what we're, naming's hard, right? So Ionic Angular, we're currently at Ionic Angular V3. And so the next version is going to be Ionic Angular
V4.
4, right? So as far as, Ionic Core is the base
plus.
web component thing.
I think, yeah, so I think that is very important. So naming is super hard.
Yeah.
And I do see that confused sometimes. So it's important to add like the Ionic Angular
Yes.
part onto there because they're like you said, there's an Ionic Core package, which is all the Ionic components ported to web
That
components.
works everywhere. It could
Yep,
work in
that's
just
so
a
if you-
WordPress site.
If you like React or if you want to use like Stencil to build your whole app, or if you want
Exactly.
to use Vue, whatever, WordPress, then you'll be using Ionic Core. But Ionic Angular 4, the naming thing is,
Yeah.
naming is extremely hard.
So maybe it makes sense to talk about like what Ionic is again, because I think people associate it with like Ionic is Angular's mobile toolkit, and that's kind of how we used to identify as that. But really, I think Ionic at the core is a UI kit to help web developers build like quality mobile apps and now progressive web apps. So we're like the bootstrap layer, if you will, for mobile. A lot of people call us that, which is fine. We love bootstrap. So in that sense, it's kind of, you should be able to use those components inside of your framework the way you use your framework, and then we're not prescriptive. I
mean, this kind of gets back to why we kind of accidentally backed into the Stencil project, because our whole goal was we understand that as a developer, you and or your team might prefer building apps with React, or you might prefer Vue, or you just want to try something new. And by getting your guys' feedback and realizing that, I think Stencil was that way for us to build Ionic in such a way that, like, if you do want to build your app with Vue, you can now with Ionic, because we don't want to have an opinion on whatever technology framework you and or your team are choosing to build with.
So we'll probably have like official ones that we support better, because I mean, doing documentation is important. Describing like how do I programmatically show and hide a menu. There may be cases where certain frameworks have to do that differently. So I think the way that we're thinking of approaching that is we will have a set of the most popular frameworks, and maybe that'll change over time as we learn. And we'll have like documentation and official starter projects. Like this is the Preact Ionic one, or the Angular, or the Angular 1 version.
Yeah, that's cool. So yeah,
I really want to support Angular 1 with Ionic again.
Yeah, and I think the cool thing is, since Ionic Core is like, since it is just web components, and at the end of the day you interact with it just like you would any other HTML element.
Yeah.
That if you already know like Preact or React or Vue, etc., it's going to be, I mean, you can use V-4 to iterate through a list, and you can put ion list in that V-4, and it's just going to work.
And I think the other thing we should talk about, like, because we have a lot of feature requests that are custom components, like swipeable tabs, let's say. One of the reasons I think why it's hard for us to work on those components is because we have to spend a lot of time in interopting with frameworks, and that actually eats into a lot of our development time.
Yeah.
So one of the motivations for moving Ionic 4 to web components is we want more time to work on our components and less time having to think about the framework, because we don't feel like we need to really have an opinion on that. That's up to you now. So we're hungry to kind of get back and really focus on Ionic UI components, do those really, really well, because that's why people use our framework.
Right, and like our focus is, or the API we're running against is just the DOM, which is a very solid thing's not changing. Whereas, other frameworks are constantly evolving, and so we have to redo Ionic each time that something changes within that framework.
That's one of my favorite things. Is it is kind of a joke. It's kind of hard to say that, but like breaking changes should be able to be less in the future, at least to a certain point. Because I mean, like web standards, like web workers, for example, have been around for a long time and they haven't changed in forever. Or like the geolocation API. I wish it was promise-based. I wish it would change, but it's been in there for a while. It's in browsers and it hasn't changed for a while. So you can ship a site and not, never look at it again. And you don't really have to worry about it, like all of a sudden just blowing up one day. Yeah,
and this has been the year, really. If you look at the standards and what stuff is now accepted norms that we knew, years past you could never use this API. Look at the caniuse.com, and it's amazing that the things that we are able to actually use. Is a big part of Stencil.
What webcando.com is pretty cool too.
Yeah.
That shows you some of the things like you can build a camera in the browser now, and it even works in Safari now finally.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
it's pretty cool.
And I guess we haven't really even mentioned like a lot of this push. A lot of the reasons for all this stuff coming together was PWAs, because we're already the web. We're already using JavaScript and HTML, CSS. Yep. So when PWAs came out, it's like, oh, this is obvious. Like this is exactly what we should be doing.
So I'm going to stop you there because we're going to get to PWAs.
Don't get me going on
Very
PWAs.
excited to talk about PWAs, but I want to make sure that we also have some time to answer some questions first. So we're going to take an intermission in a second. Real quick, a few things I quickly wanted to mention that are also going to be new with Ionic 4 is we have a brand new version of Ionicons, our open source icon font and just icon pack library. I went in and painstakingly updated a lot of those icons.
700.
How many did you update?
700 plus.
Each one by hand.
And there's going to be some changes. So, the latest version of iOS kind of changed how they want you to do icons. And so, of course, we're still going to make previous versions of Ionicons available, but the new version is going to go away from that like thin and filled state. If you kind of get how Apple used to do things with iOS, they've moved away from that, and in their documentation says to not do that anymore. So made a bit of changes to the iOS forms, updated them to be sort of the latest style that Apple wants your icons looking like. So we're going to be pushing out a new update to Ionicons, hopefully in the next, I don't want to say any dates, but soon.
I think a cool point to add to that too is that Ion Icon, which allows you to use those icons, is now a web component.
Yeah,
that you built Stencil.
Right. So you can have unlimited.
Yep. And instead of pulling in like the huge, icon file that was like something kilobytes, right? Yeah, it was super big. It's it now just loads exactly what you use. So if you just want to use like one of Ben's awesomely designed icons, on your site, you could just throw an Ion icon, and it's only going to load that one icon.
Right.
Yep, and it's
So
using
it's-
SVGs now.
Yeah, and
It's
it's
allowed
SVGs now,
Adam
too.
to allow me to add more icons to the
Yeah, it's
My-
been a
my-
long running thing.
The Ionicons is my favorite GitHub repo, the issues, because there's so many like hilarious icon requests on here.
Yes,
The
like the
bubble
save
layer.
icon. I've been given such a hard time over the save icon.
There's some really obscure ones that people are shocked that
I got it
that-
done. Just so everyone knows and is clear, the save icon has been
Birthday
made
cake.
and will be in the next version
Is it
of
a floppy
Ionicon.
disk?
It's
And
a fucking
There's actually
floppy
an issue
disk.
open by Brandy right there about the save icon.
If there's
But
ever
you know what?
Thumbs
I
up.
give the people what they want. So they want
a floppy
they
Apple
want a
won't
floppy
give it to
disk.
them.
I'll
even
give
know
them
what
a
that is,
floppy
like
disk.
it's a floppy disk.
Yeah, I
Three
know
and a
what
half.
floppy disk
Okay.
is.
So a few other changes. iOS, what are we on? 11, or whatever the
Yeah.
latest version is. Introduced some new UI paradigms as well. So we're also going to be going through in Ionic 4 all of our UI components and just updating them to be reflective of the latest like UI styles in iOS and Android. So they're going to look great across iOS and Android. We did had a question in here not too long ago about whether or not we were going to still support platform continuity. Of course we will. So if you don't know what platform continuity is, basically when you run your app in iOS or Android, Ionic will, if you want it to, it will by default, try to display the components, the UI components, in a way that reflects like the standard look and feel of that particular platform. So in iOS, if you load an Ionic app up in an iPhone, it'll kind of look and feel like a stock iOS
Yeah, and I think
app, and the same goes for Android.
And that's
Yeah,
an
it's-
Ionic core too, so
Yeah,
you don't
so
have
it will
to.
be in V4.
Yeah,
This is
it's-
just the
it
question.
doesn't matter what framework you use.
It's all baked in by default. You don't have to do anything. If you don't want it to do that, you can obviously turn it off and target
say
specific
specifically, yeah.
look and feel however you want.
So one question about that, this is more about PWAs, but I think it's relevant here. Like people often ask, or one thing we talk a lot about is like, what do you do on a PWA when it comes to platform continuity? Like, and I think
Oh, right.
what we've decided is it doesn't really make sense to display an iOS native UI in a browser. We're kind of thinking that material design is probably a better choice for
Right.
PWAs because it's just a little bit built more in mind for the web.
So
Yeah, and
actually,
It's
It's a
defaulted.
little more neutral.
You can change it to be iOS if you wanted, but the
Yeah.
default
Yep.
is we're saying
Yeah,
that
yeah.
so
if
this
you're
is
on
a
the web.
perfect segue into Q&A. So I
Yeah,
want to shift gears here. We've talked a little bit about Stencil and Ionic Framework v4. I didn't want to get into when it's going to be released because I don't like
when?
I don't like cornering us. But Adam, when is it going to be released?
When are we gonna get it
Adam,
done?
you have a
Hey. The
Check
timeline on that was like a month ago, right?
Soon.
Basically, it's ASAP is our
Soon.
timeline.
If it was done, we'd release it. If it's not done, I don't know. We don't want to ship something that's
Well,
not done, right?
So
We
I will
want
say
to-
that, like, if you look at Ionic Core, that is on NPM.
Yeah.
A lot of the Ionic, well, I shouldn't say a lot. There are some Ionic components that aren't there yet. Some of them that aren't completely done yet.
Navigation is a big
Navigation
one.
is not done yet, yeah. But you can actually, so like I said, if you go on to stenciljs.com/demos, or if you follow me on Twitter, well, we've already been building demos. I think you built an app with Ionic Core and Stencil.
Yeah, I mean, it
I
works
built a
really
few.
well.
Yeah, it already works pretty well, but it is, beta, so you might run into things that are broken.
And
I
Dan
think-
and
all right,
Ken,
I
they
want-
both
I-
got stuff going.
The way of looking at it really quick is like we have a high bar with Ionic 2. So we need to make sure that Ionic 4 meets that bar
Yep.
before we release it. But technically, it's actually usable right now.
Technically, it's there, but you just keep in mind that it's beta and stuff might not be there, or you might run into weird bugs.
And it's in the core branch. So at Ionic, the core branch is what
Yep.
we're working on, and then it's all into
Yep.
NPM right now.
Okay, I'm cutting you guys off.
All right.
We're going to move into some Q&A. So actually, that's
Cool.
a good segue. One of the questions that someone posted here is the desktop browser sort of mode going to get more attention in the future?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And actually, we already have someone that's helping us out with that a lot. It's been a large project of ours that has always been on the back burner that we want to do. But absolutely, like with this transition to Ionic Core, we're making sure that everything's going to be working great in desktop.
And PWAs too. So progressive
Right.
apps, you can open them anywhere that there's a web browser server, from like my Xbox One at home to my Surface or.
So actually, I think this brings up an interesting topic about what Ionic framework is, because when we initially released it, it was hyper focused on building native look and feel mobile
Yes.
apps, and it still is, and absolutely you can still do that. But I think as we've invested more and more in the web, and while at the same time the web has come back in power and style, we've seen Ionic get pushed to its limits in terms of where people want to put it. And one of the places that a lot of people are pushing Ionic is to desktop environments, especially, I mean, Justin, right now, I mean, you're not on desktop, but you have a nice little sort of portable.
It can be a desktop if I
Yeah,
plug it
what
into my
is-
keyboard.
What the hell is
So
that,
this
by
is
the
a
way?
Surface Book.
Okay. All right.
It's pretty cool. So it's a Surface Book. So it is the one, I'm the one person here that uses. So I still have a
Are you-
MacBook Pro, but I do use Windows 10 a lot.
Good for you, Jeff.
So it's
It's like
It's-
You're a brave man.
Every office needs to have Windows 10.
it's not always fun. As Adam can probably attest to, there's a lot of cussing that goes on in the morning sometimes over at my desk, but it does work, and it's pretty cool. So it's a tablet now, and then I can plug it into my keyboard and use it just like a regular
But yeah,
laptop.
like
All right, next question.
desktop
Yeah.
is very
Moving you
important.
guys
We
on.
love,
Okay,
we love
moving on.
Absolutely. So the short answer is yes,
Yes.
absolutely. We are going to
We're already
be
working on it.
transitioning Ionic from just a mobile-only focused UI toolkit
to a
to
web
something that
focus.
can,
Yeah.
web focus essentially. You
I mean,
want to put in
that's the
desktop,
dream,
great.
right?
That's the
Ones
dream.
Run everywhere.
It runs everywhere. Maybe eventually they'll be running in cars.
Yeah,
You
and
should
really,
check out
and
Adam's
that's
talk on
just
it,
real
by the
quick
way.
that, help us with what things you don't think are right in desktops. Like you're designing everything we've built is like, we knew it's going to look good into a mobile, but as you expand it, it's like, it's not going to that wouldn't do that in desktop. So let us know, submit issues.
All right, this is going to be rapid fire. You guys can't go
Yeah,
on
let's
tangents
go.
here.
Let's
All
go.
All right.
All right.
No more tangents.
All right, does anyone know if Laravel works well as a backend for Ionic?
It works
Or
great.
PHP.
A lot of people use it.
A lot of people use it. It works great.
Yeah.
All right, how do you theme web components?
Everything web components. Well, so that's another big part of it, is that we want to make sure that CSS is largely the same. So how you've been styling your CSS today is going to be largely the same with the web components.
Yep.
We are not using Shadow DOM at this time to make it easier for this transition. So we basically already manually scoped the CSS so that it could work on any single page and not be affected. So we've kind of done the hard work of scoping the CSS to begin with. And so with that, you can continue to style things just how you always have. And eventually someday we'll probably move to Shadow DOM. And that said, we also have CSS variable support already in there.
Okay,
And so kick those in.
there you go.
There you go.
You can still use Sass if you want, but CSS variables are a great way to start doing a app-wide theming.
All right. Okay, next question. I want Vue. When will that be coming?
Vue.js?
Yeah.
Well, technically, if you
I
read,
guess
if
today.
you follow
Usually.
Joshua Maroney, it's already here.
Josh has
right.
a lot of good articles.
Yeah.
It's Ionic Core and Vue.
I mean, that's kind of the point, is like, you don't have to wait on us. You just drop in our components, assuming that frameworks are good citizens and support web components.
Yep. And I've actually used it in Vue. It works really well, actually. Yeah.
Great. And we'll probably have some like recipes and demos and starter apps
Yeah.
like that we want to build
Definitely.
once V4 is
I
out
think
to show
Vue,
people how to
yeah.
do that sort of
I
stuff.
think
Vue.
Vue is going to be one of our like recommended
Yep.
options.
Vue's
PWA
tiny,
server,
small,
yeah.
fast. It's
Yeah.
awesome.
All right, guys. Do you think that hybrid apps will ever replace native in the future completely?
It's not about that. I mean, you're building a native app, right? Like I can just as easily access HealthKit API on a hybrid app as I can on a native app. It's about saving you 95% of the time when you're targeting different platforms. It's not about limiting you. So we'll talk a little bit about the end about how we're going to take that even further, but I don't care if it kills native apps, because you're shipping native apps. Like, we don't want it to kill native apps.
Yeah, and I think it's also a comparison to, like, there are still desktop apps that are very useful. But today, if your boss told you to build an application for your corporation, you're probably going to use the web, so because it's just a lot easier than firing up, Visual Basic and firing, creating an actual executable Windows file compared to just doing a web application. So I think it's very same. But at the same time, the web didn't kill applications.
And it really comes down to your use case in a way too. Like, I mean, you can do like really high-end like 3D WebGL and WebAssembly and stuff too.
Right.
But I mean, you're not going to be building Call of Duty and
Use
in
cases.
web stuff in the next few years at least.
And that's the nice thing about Cordova and Ionic, et cetera, is you can mix in native code if you need that escape hatch, an escape hatch that lets you do what you need to do today and hopefully abstract it and make it cross-platform in the future.
Okay. Jacob has been just clamoring to know.
All right.
Can we touch upon lazy loading in an offline first progressive web app?
Yes, I would love to talk. So
So we could save that because we're going to.
Justin's been waiting his whole life.
All right,
Justin,
This is your
Hold
moment.
it in a bit longer,
Okay,
Justin, because
okay.
we're going to answer that question in a bit. I should
I
have
think that'll come
jumped
up
the gun.
good in PWAs,
All
right?
right, well, we're going to talk about that. All right, a few more questions, and then we got to move on to some other topics. What are our plans for supporting URL routes for navigation?
That is a very hard topic, but we are working on that. One thing that we're really addressing is trying to make the router of that framework kind of be the the one that controls it. And so like with Angular, we want to use the Angular router as best as possible. And so we've been doing a lot of research in that. I know Dan and Ken have both been doing a lot of work into that, but it's very difficult. And another thing that we're working on, or that we've always kind of had within Ionic, is that we want it to replicate native applications. Whereas traditionally the web is just, a singular line of you go forward, you go backwards. But with native applications such as, think of the Play Store or App Store, you have different tabs, and each tab has a different
stack, navigation stack.
It has a different stack within each tab. So we've always tried to replicate, what native does and how it acts, because, everyone's familiar with how their phone works. But when it comes to web development, it's kind of different. So
you don't have a back button when you're rendering in a native shell.
Exactly. So
at least not a browser Chrome back button.
So having a URL to represent kind of a traditional native thing is very difficult. But I will say that I think that we've been doing a lot of awesome updates recently, and like with Ionic Core, a lot of the hard work that Dan and Ken have been doing is going to go into
this. It's been a priority for us because we know that like the PWA mode of navigation is not the native way. So I think we're working on a good middle ground that simplifies what we have today and makes it possible to do native and web style routing more easily.
Yep. Yeah. I think it'll come up in the PWA chat for sure, but we also have, if you want to go like full on PWA, we do have a stencil router too that implements that very classic like URL, just like React router or something like that.
Yeah.
So one more question, then we're going to move on.
Yeah.
Ionic 1 components, how will they at all work with Stencil?
So this is a personal pet project of mine. Ionic 1 components, the code today will not work in Stencil. Like, let's be clear about that. What will work and what is actually better is that Ionic 4 components will work in Angular 1. So unfortunately, you're not going to have a situation where you're going to be able to just take your Ionic 1 app and magically move to Ionic 4 tomorrow. Like, that's not going to happen. Yeah. But moving to Ionic 4 will mean changing some HTML tags, getting rid of, we had like a delegate system. We don't use that anymore, so that won't exist. But you'll be able to keep 90%, 95% of your Angular code. And so it's a much smaller transition than going to Angular 2. So I've done some testing. I wrote like a little shim for this, and it works really, really well. Angular just needs it needs a simple directive that maps properties to web component properties. Otherwise, they don't update properly. But with a simple like directive wrapper that we can auto-generate, so we don't actually have to support any Angular code at all, it just works. So it's probably not going to be the number one priority for us, but I think if we can give Ionic 1 users a way into the future, like that's awesome. I would love to be able to do that.
I think so.
Well, it speaks to like we don't, let whatever framework of choice.
Exactly.
Yeah. That way you can keep your old code, but still be able to use the new Ionic components.
All right, there is one more question I want to ask. Will any improvements to Cordova native APIs ever happen?
Let's talk about that in a little bit.
All right, we're going to hold off on that answer. All right, so let's talk about PWAs.
Yes.
All right, Justin has just been waiting for his whole life. He's just been waiting to talk about this. So can someone just, in case anyone still doesn't know or maybe has questions, what is a progressive web app?
Yep. So I like to think of a progressive web app as basically you combine like the best parts of like an app that you install from the Play Store with the best of what the web offers. So a progressive web app is basically just a website that uses some newer technology to give you a more app-like experience. So it uses things like service workers and a web manifest to allow you to make sure that, when you go to your PWA in the browser, even if you're offline or you're on a flaky network, it's still going to work. Just like, you can be offline and pull up a native app and it's still going to render for you. PWAs can do the same thing. They also have a web manifest. So it's especially on Android, there's a pretty cool thing where if you're, you can like go to twitterlike.com or twitter.com today on a mobile device. Chrome's going to pop up a little banner that says, hey, would you like to install this to your home screen? And that allows you to actually like I could, pull up Twitter and it's going to be in my app drawer right there along all the native apps. It'd be in your settings. It's just like a native app, but it's really just a website.
So it's basically a web app.
It's a really nice web app.
But it's optimized to load quickly and give the user a native-like experience as though they were actually interacting with a native app. But they don't
it's just
have
a really
to
nice, really modern web app.
So how does that affect? Did you have something to add?
Well, I often say too, it's a mindset change. Like for a long time, companies were looking at mobile as, oh, we're just going to tell anyone who comes from the mobile web, like all right, screw you, go download the app in the App Store.
Like
Because,
the Reddit banner.
Like, well, the Reddit Reddit does that today.
Sorry, Reddit. But.
You deserve it. But when you think about what you're losing there, like it's risky to take a user who came in from a Google search and say, hey, we're glad you're here, but like go do 5 steps, install our app, sign up for our push notifications. Like,
so that's exactly what I was going to say, which is like, what are the like accessibility benefits of PWA?
So,
and I know that you have stats on that because there've already been some major
definitely.
brands.
So like Pinterest, for example, so they went, so Pinterest is a PWA now. So if you go to Pinterest.com, it's a progressive web app. So they went from like their old web app experience, which wasn't that great, to their new progressive web app. They went, they had 100% increase in people like interacting with the app, just for making it a better website. So and like Max said, so you go from like, when you go to the Reddit, and we call it Reddit again, it pops up the banner and it says, hey, would you like to download our app? Then you have to click that, which then opens up the Play Store. Then you have to click through, install it. If you're on 3G, APKs are really big compared to websites. It's going to take a minute. And by that time, you may be like, hey, I don't need Reddit that much.
Right.
Maybe you forgot. Maybe you had to go to the bathroom or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It always happens that way. I'm usually already on.
It's whereas like if you go to like Pinterest.com today, you are immediately put right into the experience. Just from it goes from like 5 steps to click a link, boom, experience, you're ready to go.
And I think it's something that's not talked about enough is how the development of it. So let's say that you're just doing an internal application, how much easier it is to put something together, have it on your intranet, and then anyone in your company that has access on the internet on their phone.
So like enterprise is a good example. Like we talk a lot with big companies and they constantly bring up PWAs because they're used to distributing web apps and like securing them on their network. What's foreign to them is having to go through like a third party MDM solution to like manage.
Just
to kind of come back to like what they already had in a
You already have servers, you already have VPN, you already have all the phones. I mean,
so it allows you.
It's a bunch of bullshit like fences that are like non-necessary essentially for them to get from like their app to user.
Just a quick break. I told everyone that I wasn't going to swear, and everyone agreed. And then that's the only
So yeah,
sorry.
It allows you to skip like the.
Brody,
at least it's not
bleep it out.
So it allows you to skip, especially at the App Store.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Justin.
So like if you've ever shipped an app to the App Store, it can be. I know I've lost a few brain cells over trying to get something into the App Store.
Well, it's not free. It's not.
And it's you have to pay, and it's really annoying. It goes from submitting it to Apple, hoping that they actually accept what you built, put it on the App Store. It goes from that to just put it on a hosting service. There's a lot of cool hosting services today, along with some pretty cool hosting services coming out.
Yeah, what are you
getting at?
So one of the things I've kind of hinted around on Twitter about is we are working on Ionic PWA hosting. So this will come into the PWAs. So this will allow you to go to use Ionic PWA hosting, and it's going to have all the best like practices. So like HTTP2 push, all handled for you, all built in. So you'll be able to
do, right?
Yeah, and that's super hard. So
it needs to be an SSL.
So for example, so the hosting service that I've used a lot, I'm not going to name it, but they do support HTTP2 push, but it's very hard to set up. And I can't tell you how many hours I wasted wondering why I'm getting some random 404 when the actual issue was that I was like missing a comma somewhere. So we're that's not the greatest developer experience to us. So we're moving to a more doing it the Ionic way, really, which is we do the hard stuff for you. We handle making sure that you're following the best practices, and so you can get a really fast PWA.
Yeah, and like Ionic Core is definitely built for this experience to make sure that the files are tiny, small, that they can be cached on the CDN for forever because all the file names are hashed. So all the benefits that you want to see in a PWA is like a download it once, it's gonna be blazing fast the first time you get it.
That's like
second time you get it.
That's like the benefit of having a compiler as part of the process.
Exactly.
Too. And TypeScript, you can kind of just infer things.
And the developer can write nice, clean, verbose code, but then the compiler turns it into something that's very fast.
So that kind of goes into something I've been playing around with, like a naming thing is the Ionic PWA toolkit. I know I've talked to you, Ben, about it, where you take the Stencil app starter, which is basically an app starter that allows you to use Stencil to build your entire app with web components if you want to. And then if you suck at CSS like I do and you want some nice, a nice UI, you can use Ionic Core for UI components. That way you don't have to design anything. And then, you can use Ionic PWA hosting. So you can go from 0 to 100 with best practices built in, lazy loading, code splitting, etc. And then once you get to the hosting side of it, HTTP2, HTTP push, all handled for you. You don't have to do anything about it. Completely zero config. I could go on for days about it, but
It sounds lovely.
a 0 to 100 solution for building
You
a
sold
really
this.
nice,
Great.
fast
I'm
video.
in.
I'm in, Justin. How do I sign up? All
How
right.
do
So
I give you my money? Well, I want to just really quickly address one thing because people always bring this up. Like, our PWA is going to kill native apps, and like,
Right.
where do we stand on that? And I think, like, for us, it's totally dependent on your business. If you are doing really well in the App Store, users find you in the App Store, like you're confident, like that's a good strategy. We want to help you with that. Like, we think we can help you with native apps in the App Store and on the web and desktop and whatever else. Like, that's why you pick Ionic, because the web runs everywhere, and so should Ionic.
And
But
that's
we don't like really care if a PWA is like going to kill a native app or vice versa.
Right.
That's really up to you.
and the core of how Ionic is built is to ensure that you're writing code once. You're not having all these if statements of like, if I'm on Android, I need to do this and you do this, but rather having one code base that works everywhere.
So we don't really care where you ship to. You ship to the web with Ionic, and then the cool thing about the web is it runs everywhere. So you can run it everywhere from have an app in the Play Store to a PWA to whatever.
Yep, exactly.
Maybe
Okay.
even space.
So another question
There you
that I think gets asked a lot that we should probably address, which is where does Apple kind of sit in with all of this, with PWAs, and like how is that going to factor into people who do want to target PWAs as a destination?
Well, I have strong opinions on this. I think just looking at looking at the facts.
Oh, that's yours.
Looking at the facts, like Apple is moving to support these APIs.
Yep.
Like they are working on service workers.
Service
right?
workers are coming. They're actually moving along pretty fast too. I think I've seen Mike. He's been messing around with service workers in Safari technical preview, and the last thing I saw, he said that the API was already stubbed out. Wasn't totally working, but it was there. You could access it.
I mean, and
so
also
yeah.
I should say that the tipping point for us to use web components in Ionic was that Apple supported
Safari finally.
everything we're looking for, and they already have all the dynamic imports, ES6, all the stuff that we want.
So I think eventually they're going to support it, and that's going to be awesome. I think in the
Yeah.
meantime, like I said, PWAs are a mindset change. So when you think about what progressive means, it means that when there are more APIs available, your app can take advantage of them. So it's up to you to decide, like, do I absolutely have to have a service worker or push notifications for me to move to the web? If so, then you'll want to keep a native app around and
Yeah.
go that way. But if the
Yeah.
answer is like, no, like let's say you have a new site, well, maybe then the mindset shift is maybe I should not load 300 megabytes of ads and maybe I
For
have
sure.
a better web experience. And that to me is a progressive web app too. It's
Yes.
really
Yep.
a mindset shift. So I tell people you can build PWAs on iOS if you just change the way you think about your web strategy.
And I think the progressive part of that is super important, right? So like if you pull up Twitter Lite on your iPhone 10 today, it's still a really badass web app, right? Like it's not going to do push notifications like I can get on my Android phone. It's not going to work offline like I can do on my Android phone. But it's still a really upgraded experience from what Twitter did have on the web before.
Yes, and it's 10 times more accessible.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah. So it's
And,
just like, if you think about where these companies came from, like the web was not part of their mobile approach at all. So PWAs
Right.
is all about like, oh, we can actually build a performance web app. Like maybe we should take that seriously again. To me,
Yeah.
that's PWA.
And
Yeah.
I think one part that we should touch on too is like, so here in the US we have like iPhones and Android phones with tons of storage and tons of
Fast,
RAM.
yeah.
Like the iPhone 10 has like a better CPU than I think I have in my Surface.
Probably.
Certainly.
And some MacBooks actually, the MacBook Air. But that's great, but that's not the case for everybody.
Right.
And the web is one of the most accessible platforms out there. You can access it pretty much from anywhere. So making it work for everybody is key.
Mhm.
So APKs, IPAs, those are great, but they tend to be very large. Downloads are very large. And in some cases, your whole data plan might be blown away just from downloading Twitter off the Play Store,
Yeah.
which I think is just like that's just stupid.
Yeah, and that's again speaks to just how Stencil is designed to allow for tying.
Exactly. Yeah. So and with how the web works, and then with like how Stencil works and Ionic Core, and it's all lazy loaded and code split. You're going from I think the Twitter had a good example. There's a slide out there that shows like the Twitter APK is like 40 something megabytes, and the Twitter Lite on the first view only loads like 15 something kilobytes of code or something like that. So if your data plan really matters to you, if you have a phone like the average like $100 Android phone that doesn't have a lot of storage, doesn't have a lot of RAM, etc., PWAs are going to be a much better accessible experience for you. And
Speaking of accessibility, I should also add that with Ionic Core, we put a lot of time into accessibility, into how that works. And actually, I'm sorry, I totally just derailed this. I just remember that we didn't talk about the Ionic iOS 11 updates.
Oh yeah,
we did. We did a little
design
bit.
changes.
Yeah, I mean the design changes to the component.
Yeah. So okay, did we talk about that?
We did.
I did. I
Okay,
made.
well, big congrats to awesome for Brandy and Cam
Yeah,
and
Brandy
Mike.
did a
Yes,
great job.
yeah, the
A lot
whole
of hard
team has
work
been
on that,
working
yeah.
super hard to get these updates put into the framework.
Those
so
iOS 11 cards look so
Yeah.
awesome.
they look hot,
Really
and we're
like
adding
this.
in the nice translucent blur effect on
Yep.
iOS,
Yeah,
so it's
Manu
going to
put
be
that
hot. And Manu's been part of that. And just to call out, Brandy is also the reason why the save icon is going into icons.
Thank you, Brandy.
Thanks, Brandy. So if you want to thank anyone, that's Brandy. Make
And
sure
we
to
should
thank
give
her.
a shout out to Mike for handling the
iOS
iPhone 10 and iOS 11.
Yes,
Yeah, the
Mike
little cutout
Hardington killed it on.
It was
all
not
the
easy.
Yep.
iPhone
That was
10
not a
stuff.
fun experience, but he did a pretty good job on it. So
Yeah.
very good job.
I mean, the whole team has been working super hard to get this stuff out, and it will be out as soon as, like Adam said, as soon as it's done. So we're racing towards releasing it as soon
You
as
can
we
test it out
possibly
today.
can.
Yeah.
And it's going to be awesome. We are so pumped about it. I don't think I've been this excited about a version of Ionic. I keep getting progressively more excited
That's huge.
about each version of Ionic, and this one in particular, because
Yeah,
it's
it's
going
gonna
to
be
be certainly make progressive web apps a first-class citizen in
Yep.
Ionic, which is another question that keeps coming up: is will Ionic 4 basically can you build PWAs with Ionic?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Let's go into. Should we move on?
I
Because we
think
can
I
talk
think we
about
only
this
have
too.
one other topic, and we have a big announcement.
It's
today.
the thing that we tricked everyone into watching the show for.
That's right.
Gotcha.
You've all been fooled. We actually have nothing to announce. That's it. I'm kidding. We have something really exciting to talk about. Should we
Yeah.
transition into it? I can.
Well, yeah, so there was a question there about Cordova and native APIs. And we've actually been working on a new project for a little bit. We've been quiet about to kind of reimagine the native layer of Ionic. So historically, we've used Cordova, we built Cordova plugins. Every single Ionic app is a Cordova app. So when the strategy is kind of this PWA strategy is kind of come into our lives, so to speak, we've been kind of trying to think about how do we actually focus on building PWAs and web content first, and then enabling them to do a bunch of native stuff easily, which has been a little bit difficult right now. So we've been working on a new project. We're calling it Avocado, codename Avocado. It might not be the official name, but it's basically a native bridge. So you can write plugins, and one thing that we're doing is we're kind of updating a lot of the way that you write plugins and interact with them. So you start by writing a TypeScript file and a TypeScript interface, which specs out all the different types that your plugin's going to accept. So let's say you're building a custom camera feed. A TypeScript file will let you define to the user and document what exactly the arguments are for the camera, what data it returns. You don't really have to guess. It's just kind of all there. We can use that interface to then generate a starting point for a Swift file. We're using Swift for this, for building plugins, and Swift has become pretty dominant in iOS. If you search on Stack Overflow, if you try to get help, it's a lot easier to find Swift information these days, which kind of happened recently. So
Objective-C is, I don't really like looking at Objective-C.
Objective-C is kind of falling behind, and we think that we can get more developers building high-quality native plugins by moving to Swift. They're easier to write, they're easier to maintain, there's more documentation about it now. And then on Android, we're looking into Kotlin, but Kotlin hasn't broken through quite as much as Java has, but luckily there's like a tool you can translate Java to Kotlin and later. So if it ends up dominating like Swift or taking over, I think we'll do that.
There's some big apps actually already having, I saw that like the native Pinterest app already uses Kotlin in some parts of it.
Yeah, so we're kind of looking at that and saying like, we want to really quickly track what native projects are doing to build native functionality and kind of support it.
So let's talk about Avocado.
Yeah.
This may not end up being what we call it officially. I think it's been our sort of internal working name as we've been working on this for a while. And we wanted to give you guys kind of a sneak peek into kind of what we're up to these days and where we're spending some of our time. So why Avocado? I mean, you kind of got into that a little bit, but what are some of the benefits that you're going to get from using Avocado as a means to sort of bridge that gap between your web assets and native functionality?
So one of the bigger changes that we wanted to make from our own usage of Cordova and building plugins we felt like having a little more control over the native project when we needed it would have been really, really helpful. So for example, let's say we're working on an iOS app. We want the iOS project to actually be a source artifact. So you're going to commit the iOS project into your actual app. So you're going to be able to go and say, I just want to write some Swift here to do one thing. I'm going to quickly write that. I'm going to commit this whole project into my repo. Oh, I need to go and update a permission. Well, I'm going to update it in Android Manifest because that's how Android works. And I'm going to follow documentation and Stack Overflow posts and try to use around the edges of your app, which is like the 5% where you actually have to think about native code. We want to just kind of use whatever official Android is using or official iOS is using.
Mm-hmm. So a bit more standards.
Yeah, and moving to like the official dependency management system, so like CocoaPods, and treating things as frameworks. So instead of having the code or a plugin in your project, you're going to have a framework which is externalized and it's not in your actual code base, and you can update it kind of independently.
And I think one cool thing too is like Android Studio and Xcode, for example, a lot of these things still handle for you, right? So like if you install a library or something like that and you need to include it in your Gradle build, you'll get a prompt on Android Studio that says, hey, this you need to configure this, and here you can click this button and boom, it works.
Yeah.
You don't have to understand Xcode and Android Studio, but if you really want to dive in and add some more native functionality, you have those powers now.
Yeah, it makes that escape hatch a little more accessible. And for example, one thing that we've kind of struggled with, and I think developers have, is trying to use, for example, iOS through the command line is really hard. And it's hard to do it because Apple built a lot of their emulation and simulation and running on device optimized around Xcode. So by just opening Xcode and hitting the play button, I personally find that I get a much better developer experience than using the command line.
Right.
So that's an example where we kind of just want to defer to the tool that's best at the job, but save you 95% of the effort building apps.
Well, and I feel like it also kind of like opens up your ability to kind of know what's going on a bit more behind the hood, so to speak, instead of having it completely like abstracted away from your ability to debug and understand.
With abstractions, you can get to the point where you're abstracting things away so far that it actually becomes harder than it should be. Than if you kept it a little bit more just standardized and lower level.
Yeah, and another thing is like how we're enabling, PWAs. Again, we already talked about at length about this stuff, but PWAs have emerged, and there's some new kind of concepts behind it. Like we wanted to make sure that you can develop once, have it run great on PWA, but also you deploy it to the App Store with the same code base. And so with Avocado, we're able to kind of rethink a lot of how that would work, and allowing to transition the same code base between the two without having issues.
Having like really seamless first-class web fallbacks.
Yep.
But also, there's going to be a few more like tangible changes. So, for example, with Cordova today, a lot of the plugins are kind of separated out. We've decided to build in the most common 80% of plugins as default part of the API of Avocado. So you don't need to install them; you get them by default. We've updated the file plugin is a big one that we wanted to improve. We made the API more Node.js-like, so it kind of breaks away from following the defunct file system web spec.
And speaking of that, you brought up something I think that I also wanted to make sure we touched on, which is, Avocado is using a lot of modern tooling now to allow it to be, at least from our perspective, a better developer experience, right?
Oh, yeah,
Can you talk about like kind of how we've kind of used modern tooling as a way to create an experience that we think is just super streamlined and
I mean, I mentioned TypeScript. I think that's one of the biggest things, like having typing information. That's why we built Ionic Native, is we saw the Cordova plugin ecosystem wasn't completely adopting types. And so we wanted to provide types, but also
a consistent API too.
And be able to just import a module like you normally would in any other code base. You should be able to import camera and run it.
And then Promisify and have observable support. So this is actually Ionic Native, but with actual native code too. So we're kind of blending the two worlds.
So I guess that's what I was going to get at was, is there a scenario in which the Avocado project kind of morphs into the next version of Ionic Native, or is it going to be something that's going to be separate for a while? Or how does that how do you reconcile that?
We want people to think about this as one Ionic experience. So when you come and use Ionic, we help you with the native side, we help you with the web side, we help you with the hosting and updating side. Like we want to have kind of a full stack experience. But we think that we can, like the rest of the ecosystem, it can find this useful, and we want to work on an open source project and maintain it that other projects outside of Ionic can use, like Onsen.js or Framework 7 We want them to be able to use this and benefit from it. We think that's ultimately a net positive and it's probably better.
And even Ionic can benefit from this for, so we've got a bunch of overlays that, look just like native, but if you're on native, Ionic is able to detect that, like, I want to show an alert. We can use the real native alert. And this is something that we can easily do with Avocado, which was traditionally kind of,
and the developer doesn't have to know, it's
the same stuff. It's just open alert.
On that note, we've also been inspired by the company Basecamp and DHH is kind of the figurehead.
David Heinemeier Hansen.
Yeah, he's been, and the team has been doing a lot of writing about what they call like the hybrid sweet spot. And the hybrid sweet spot is using, let's say, native navigation controls or native side menus and drawers, but keeping 80 to 90% of your app web-based. And we want to make it easy for teams to make that decision. So let's say you want to use the Android side menu because you just like the way it feels. It looks like material design perfectly, whatever. But you want to keep most of the app web so you can move quickly. We want to be able to support that. And right now, that's been hard to do. And we realize, like, if that's what you want to do, we're still going to save you so much time focusing on web first.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
And we've seen teams, I mean, when we were in NG Europe, I think we saw a team from a bank there trying this out.
They're already doing that
too, and they're already trying to push the boundaries of that and like incorporating some native stuff in with web stuff. And so I think what one of the goals of the Avocado project is to enable the mixing and blending of native and web. So it's more of like a web native project, and you can go as far in one direction as you want or the other, and it doesn't really matter so long as you're moving in the way that's most efficient for you.
Yeah, and then being able to take that code and deploy it as a PWA
with the same exact.
That's a special thing. I think about like the mobile ecosystem, and when we started Ionic, there were a lot of companies that were 100% native, so they made native development easier. And we always believe that eventually, given enough time, web would actually be a more efficient cross-platform choice. It just was a little bit early.
Mm-hmm.
So now with PWAs exploding, we feel validated that focusing on browser technology is going to enable us to do a lot more than companies that just picked a native toolkit, because now they're kind of stuck with a pure native app and they can't go to the web with PWA.
Without a complete rewrite.
Without a complete rewrite. So we're trying to
iOS and Android.
Yeah.
It's just not efficient.
Yeah. So then you end up with 3 separate repos,
code bases
basically.
And
web base, Android code base, and then iOS code base.
So we want Ionic to like take advantage of everything it has on each platform that runs.
That even includes React Native. I mean, you could use React Native is the same thing where they have web views and they have web content inside of it. With the way that Ionic Core is structured, this is the same thing. If you have a web content inside of React Native, you could use an Ion checkbox to make it look and feel just like inside your web content.
We want that web layer to be Ionic and save you a ton of time.
Yeah.
This includes Electron a little bit down the road too, right?
Yeah. So part of Avocado is it'll support Electron too, which is really, really important for us. So let's talk in terms of like timelines and stuff. So we've been working on this for a while. It's actually been an idea we've been tossing around for quite some time.
Almost a year.
Yeah, over a year, and we've been working on it a lot lately. I think we'll be able to have a public or at least a private testing in January. So we're moving really quickly on it. February for sure for something public. We're already using it. Like, it already works for iOS and Android internally. It's just not quite fleshed out enough. And we're working on the CLI and tooling to make that really easy.
So if you're interested, get in touch with us. We're going to want to have testers start testing out early previews of this once we start feeling confident about rolling it out to get feedback on it. But we are super excited about this. I think it's going to be an amazing improvement of experience getting those web assets to start working and communicating with whatever native APIs you are interested in accessing. And you can access all of them, by the way, which is a misconception, I think, a lot of times with building with web.
You call a native code, you have the full native library available.
And
it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. So I think on that point, like, Avocado allows you. So for example, if an update to Android comes out to add some new feature that is a native feature, since Avocado has that like nice API, it's where you can write plugins pretty easily. You would technically be able to access that native functionality the day it came out before anybody else had actually released a plugin for it.
Well, yeah, and the thing about that is like, there's no cross-platform benefits there anyways, because Android released a new API that is only on Android. So you might as well just write some Java and make it work.
And then you can have it working the day instead of having to wait for Cordova to add a plugin for it.
Yep. So anyways, this is an early project. We'll have a lot more information. It'll probably be a few weeks before we have like a website up.
I was
But
just gonna say, do we have a URL yet or not? Probably nothing to show for it.
we thought we did, but we realized we didn't buy it, and actually someone else owned it.
And that's actually being built.
Which is probably why we're
going
going
Yeah,
to
it's
keep
being
it
built with Stencil.
our code name Avocado.
Yeah.
It may
Yes,
not be the
sure.
final name.
We're open for ideas.
But the
right?
point is, we wanted to share with you guys this really exciting project that we've been working on, and give you kind of a sneak peek into what's in store for Ionic, as we usually try to do with the Ionic shows.
So just to sum it up, Avocado is going to help you with the native app part of your app. It's going to help you with native code. It's going to help you with building your app natively, running it in emulator, simulator, adding plugins, working with the actual native projects. That's what it's trying to work on.
And really kind of reduce, the friction and just go straight forward. Like if you do want to just open up Xcode and hit the play button or hit the build button, it's right there for you.
Embracing the native projects.
Without us automatically updating the project without you knowing and having to reset everything. So
Cool. All right. Well, these were the main topics that I had. We're trying to keep this under an hour. We went a little bit over.
Yeah.
But I mean, let us know if you like this format for the Ionic show, because I think Justin has been pushing us to get back on the horse here, and I had a lot of fun today. I don't know about you guys. I think I would love to keep doing this on a more regular basis.
Another one. Yeah, we should have another one scheduled. So with Stencil and Ionic Core, as soon as those come out, we're gonna have a pretty big push. Pushing tons of content out there for PWAs. How to use something like that kind of PWA toolkit idea that I talked about before. So we should have another Ionic show around that time. It's part of the marketing plan for it.
No definitive date, but I think,
no definitive date yet. It's going to be a little while. We just put together that plan like yesterday. But I would like to do it live streamed again if the community likes it.
It's so much easier. Like we used to spend an hour. We used to spend an hour just getting that intro.
The intro, right?
And
I can't tell you how many times I've done the intro,
And it
then
got harder and harder because we got more drunk.
Yeah, there have been times where Brody's had to come and just refill our glasses and start us over, so it looks like we're starting from the beginning. So this is definitely easier on us. If you guys enjoy this format, we're happy to keep doing live streams like this. So leave a comment, tweet at us.
Twitter.
Yeah, follow us on Twitter or follow Ionic. We'll let you know when we're going to have the next one up, and we'll probably have more news about the Avocado project. But again, this is for you guys to know about early, since you were here to watch this. And I think that's about it. We'll talk to you guys online.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
See you next time.